time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Angelina Godoy. Angelina Godoy is the Helen H. Jackson Chair in Human Rights and Director of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights. She's also professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies and Law, as Societies and Justice. Angelina, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here.
So start out, if you would, and tell us about the University of Washington Center for Human Rights.
Sure. Okay. So the Center for Human Rights was founded actually by an initiative of the Washington State Legislature, which is unusual for a Center for Human Rights at a university campus. And the idea, this was in the 2008-2009 legislative session, the idea was to pull together human rights energies that existed on campus already in departments all the way from the School of Medicine to the School of Law to the College of Arts and Sciences and many other parts of campus, and to create one kind of clearinghouse for human rights activity. And specifically to task that center with actually contributing to real-world social change for human rights. So that's also a distinguishing characteristic of our center. In other words, we're all academics. We write books, we hold conferences, and all those kinds of things that academics do. But in addition, the center's main task actually is finding ways to harness the energies of the university, the know-how that exists there, the excitement of our students, the innovative capacity that they have, and the skills of our faculty to contribute through partnerships with real-world, off-campus human rights organizations to contribute to real-world social change.
All right, and do you pretty much get to make the calls, make the decisions, hands-off from any oversight?
Yes, I would say we have faculty in all different university departments. We have a faculty steering committee that makes decisions for the center. And we receive requests from human rights organizations, some of them right here in Seattle, some halfway around the world, for research partnerships. The bulk of the way that we contribute to human rights organizations' capacity is by enhancing their research capacity. So many, many human rights organizations have research needs that they don't have the in-house capacity to address. And so this is a great partnership for us as well, because it gives us a chance to have our own students working on real world social problems, have our own faculty applying their skills to those questions that are posed by human rights organizations.
All right. And how did you get involved with the organization?
Well, I'm the founding director of the center. So when we were founded, it was just 1 year actually after I had the great honor of becoming the inaugural occupant of the Helen H. Jackson Chair in Human Rights. So part of the momentum that the donation of the funds to create the Helen Jackson Chair, those funds were created or were given to the university by the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. That gave us a lot of momentum to say, not only, wow, it's wonderful that we have this support for human rights activity on campus, but we want to take it even further. We want to build a center that'll enable us to do this work and do it at a higher level. And so that was an effort that I and others, including Peter Jackson, Senator Jackson's son, conducted over the course of 2008-2009 legislative session. And in June 2009, the bill was signed into law, creating the center.
Right. So what are some of the campaigns that you're focusing on?
Well, we have a number of different research priorities. So the work, as I said, that we are tasked with doing is working on, you name it, kind of human rights. So that runs the gamut from concerns about torture to, access to water being a human right, or access to health. So we're tasked with working on all of those human rights concerns and working on them anywhere in the world that they may arise. So we're living into that mission now by working, we have a project on rethinking punishment, which is trying to develop new ideas to combat the trend towards mass incarceration that we've seen in recent years in the United States. We have a project in El Salvador called Unfinished Sentences that I also direct. And then we have a new and growing area of human rights at home, where we are, since January of this year, working to try to figure out how we can, here in Washington State, harness some of the energies around human rights to protect and promote human rights in our state, even at the time that there have been many rollbacks in human rights at the national level in the U.S.
All right. So I want to talk a bit about some of your work directly with unfinished sentences. Is that right?
Yes.
And focus on El Salvador and Central America, which is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, as well as many of our listeners and stuff. So can you talk about that, and how did your interest initially in that field get perked?
Sure. Well, actually, I've been working on human rights in Central America for all of my professional career. And so when I had the task of being the first director of the Center for Human Rights, which had this novel mission of working in partnership with real-world organizations for social change, it made sense that I look to organizations and an area of the world where I already had pre-existing relationships and commitments. And that's kind of what gave rise to our initiative in El Salvador in particular, where around the time that the center was being created, and I was commenting to friends and colleagues of mine there about what we were doing, and several folks in the human rights movement there said to us, we could really use your help. And so that's what gave rise to this project, which is now over 5 years long, where we're working in partnership with not just one, but a variety of human rights organizations in El Salvador, all of them working on justice, understood in the broadest possible sense of the word, for crimes against humanity which happened during the armed conflict in that country. So from 1980 to 1992.
So, and within that, it seems there are multiple focuses.
That's right.
So can you talk more about that?
Sure. So, I just said justice in the broadest sense of the word. And what I meant by that is some people are interested in pursuing justice in a court of law. That's oftentimes what we understand justice to be. And that's a very important thing, which even in these recent months and weeks has seen important progress in El Salvador. But other people are also interested in other forms of justice, justice as historical memory, knowing the truth of what happened. In many cases, sadly, although it's been decades since the conclusion of the armed conflict in El Salvador, there are many, many victims who still haven't had access to information about what happened either to themselves or to a family member. So some people are interested in simply knowing the truth. Others are interested in the possibility of recovering the remains of a loved one who may have been disappeared or killed. Others are interested in promoting community projects like small museums or things like that to document what happened and to share that with the next generation and the future. So there's many different ways that folks on the ground in El Salvador are struggling to realize justice for these crimes that occurred decades ago, not only in a court of law.
So one of those areas of focus, I believe, is around the Salvadoran military's atrocities, which there were numerous ones, my understanding. And you had just put out a notice this last week about the El Mozote massacre. Can you talk about the situation with that? Maybe give us some history about what you believe happened back then?
Sure. So there were many, many, sadly, you're right, atrocities that occurred in the context of this war from 1980 to 1992. The bulk of the worst atrocities occurred in those early years of the 1980s. And in many ways, the massacre at El Mozote is kind of a symbol or a representation of the very worst of the worst of what happened, although it's a symbol of a broader trend. It's not unique in any way. So what happened in El Mozote was we're talking about in December of 1981, a U.S.-trained battalion called the Atlacal, supported by other forces, entered into the community of El Mozote in what, words come up short in describing the depravity that occurred not only in El Mozote, but in surrounding communities over the course of several days. So El Mozote was one community, but there were other communities that were also affected by this series of brutal massacres, massacres with just exorbitant violence, cruelty, systematic rapes of women, torture, the disappearance of children. So some children were taken into custody by the armed forces alive, and we still don't know what happened to them. So this was a pattern of atrocities. These occurred over the course of several days, and the best accounting that we have is that over 1,000 people were killed during those days in early December 1981. There have been forensic exhumations of some of the mass graves left by this festival of violence that have yielded now hundreds of human remains, the bulk of them of women and children. babies, very, very young children, elderly people, people that by no stretch of the imagination could have been considered combatants, and their remains have been recovered from the earth. So there's really no denying that this massacre happened now that we do have this kind of forensic evidence. However, that forensic evidence wasn't available in the immediate aftermath of the massacre. And in fact, what many of your listeners may remember is that the United States government engaged in a systematic denial that the massacre at El Mozote had ever happened. Systematic and deliberate cover-up of that massacre. So it's also a particularly ignominious chapter in U.S. history and in the history of U.S. and Salvadoran relations.
And this military unit was trained by the U.S., is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
And in fact, they were held in high esteem, weren't they? At least publicly in multiple hearings? Yes.
So this was one of the several elite battalions that the United States forces trained. And of those elite battalions, probably the one that had the most elite reputation or was most lauded, but lauded as an efficient killing force, which in fact they proved themselves to be in El Mozote.
In counterinsurgency?
Correct.
So not fighting an invading army, fighting their own people.
Fighting their own people. However, I mean, the case of El Mozote is particularly egregious because it later turned out that the community of El Mozote, these were not, first of all, they were not guerrilla combatants, and they weren't even guerrilla supporters. So this is an example of what so often happens in counterinsurgency wars where fighting forces make assumptions about civilian population, sometimes confuse them for combatants or punish them for the actions of combatants with whom they have no relationship or there's no reason why civilians, I mean, not only is it against international law, but in this case, it was also just an egregious misreading of their allegiances.
And again, for perspective on U.S. involvement here, so U.S. supported El Salvador to the tune of, I think, at least $5 billion?
Yeah, at least is the correct number because there's much of that assistance that was covert that we don't even know, above $5 million.
And supplied them, there's evidence that they supplied them with the very weapons that were used against the people in that village?
Yes, and in many other places too, yeah. So that's correct.
Okay. And on top of that, so the current situation is that it has been, what do I want to? I was going to say a trial, but it isn't. It's a reconciliation type event being held in El Salvador.
Well, no, actually, what we're seeing now. So I should take a little step back. So the massacre happened in 1981, and many other massacres both preceded it and followed it, sadly. And at the conclusion of the war, there was a Truth Commission process where the UN came in, did research in El Salvador to try to determine the truth of what happened and to share that truth with Salvadoran people and with the world. And only 5 days after that Truth Commission's report was released, the Salvadoran legislature approved an amnesty law. So that was in 1993. And that amnesty law was basically a blanket amnesty saying that any crimes that occurred during this period of time will not be investigated or prosecuted. Crimes of either side, right? Because there were crimes, including atrocities committed by the left on a much smaller scale, but they occurred there as well as by the right. And all of those crimes were then taken off the table as possible objects of inquiry or prosecution. And that basically stood as the principal impediment to justice for many, many decades until just last year. So last July, there was a historic decision of the Constitutional Chamber of the Salvadoran Supreme Court, which was finally to bring El Salvador into alliance or into compliance, rather, with international law on this point, which has long said that it is contrary to international human rights commitments to preclude prosecution for crimes against humanity. We're not talking about sundry robberies or other small crimes which may have occurred in the context of the conflict. We're talking about crimes against humanity, atrocities of the sort that happened at El Mozote. The notion that an amnesty law could block prosecution is contrary to the very notion of human rights. So finally, El Salvador's highest court recognized that last July. And since then, there's been a renewed burst of enthusiasm now in El Salvador from many who are concerned about crimes of the past, because although decades have passed, there really has been no healing process. And so many are now looking to the courts to try these cases and to investigate them. And El Mozote is the first and the largest of the cases that are now slowly making their way to the courts. So what we're seeing now is essentially pretrial proceedings for the case of El Mozote, in which we have 18 former military men. This is the most powerful men in the country, at the former high command of the military. They're all colonels and generals, are facing accusations for their participation in both as material authors and intellectual authors. In other words, those who gave the orders and those who carried out the crimes in El Mozote. So this is a really historic moment, and that's why our center has been spreading the word about it. It's a very important test of whether justice will be possible in El Salvador, and it's a really important time for folks around the world to have our eyes on that courtroom out there in rural El Salvador to make sure that these victims who are coming forward at great personal risk in acts of great courage to share these very painful stories, that they're treated with dignity and respect, and that they're afforded the protection that they need to participate in this process.
And those victims began coming forward or doing testimony here in just the last few days?
That's right. Just the last week and a half, essentially. Yes.
Okay. And any sense for how that is going?
Well, I haven't been there myself. I was there about 2 weeks ago before the victims began giving their testimony. But what I've heard from our contacts on the ground is that those have been extraordinarily tense moments in that courtroom. Moments that kind of veer between the great conviction and commitment of the victims to see justice finally done after so many decades. That's an admirable conviction and commitment that they have. But then while giving their statements on the stand, they have been, I guess the word would be humiliated, subjected to degrading treatment. And the attorneys for the military have filed a whole series, sort of a flurry of motions to try to delay the process. So to try to essentially bog down the process in legal formalities. And so yesterday, the process of victim declarations was suspended to allow the court to respond to these other procedural matters that the military, the defendants have filed in this case. So again, this suggests that you have some of the most vulnerable people in the country up against some of the most powerful people in the country. It's a test for the Salvadoran legal system, but I would say it's also a test for all of us. Because what happened at El Mozote was not only involving Salvadorans or was not uniquely a Salvadoran issue. It was something in which the United States was very heavily involved. I think now, although there's plenty of other issues to care about in the world and in the United States as well, this is a time for those of us who care about justice to pay attention to what's happening in that small Salvadoran courtroom. To listen to the words of those victims who in many cases are over 90 years old and coming forward to talk about things that happened decades ago, but which cry out for justice even today.
And one of the ways people can follow that is through your organization's website, unfinishedsentences.org.
Yes, reasonable? That's right. And in fact, we oftentimes have the capacity to update folks even faster if they follow us on Facebook. So that's the best way to stay in touch with what we're doing.
All right. Just under 10 minutes left. Your organization had uniquely filed a lawsuit against the CIA in 2014. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Actually, it was in October 2015.
Oh, sorry.
So the University of Washington filed suit against the CIA for failing to follow federal law in the Freedom of Information Act. So one piece of the way in which we've been supporting our colleagues in El Salvador as they're pushing both for truth in the sense of trying to uncover the truth about what happened in the past and also justice in a courtroom and in other places, has been trying to obtain information from the U.S. government. Because the United States government was so heavily involved in El Salvador, we do have detailed records of what happened on a day-to-day, sometimes even hour-to-hour basis in the possession of the U.S. government. And while some of those records were declassified at the conclusion of the war, there are thousands and thousands of pages of documentation that still have never seen the light of day. And so what we have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years is both analyzing the records of the government that are already declassified and seeking the declassification of further documents. It's a very laborious, highly technical process, but we have filed to date, I think, around 500 different requests for information under FOIA from 6 different U.S. federal agencies. And one of those was a request for information from the CIA that led to the lawsuit. The reason we sued was because we had requested information about a particularly well-known perpetrator. And the CIA responded initially that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of records. And if there were any records, they wouldn't be able to give them to us for reasons of U.S. national security. And then our own researchers were able to uncover 20 documents that they had already given to other people pursuant to other FOIA requests. In fact, some of those documents were even on the CIA's own website. And so what that made very clear was that they weren't complying with the law. At the very least, they could have given us the documents that were already in the public domain, because there's no argument to be made that it would threaten national security to give us documents that were already publicly known. And of course, we suspected and knew they had other documents, in addition to the 20 that we already had. So that's what gave rise to the lawsuit. The lawsuit is still ongoing, but I'm very pleased to say that in conversations with the CIA, they've now released to us over 400 pages of documents, specifically relating both to that initial request and some other issues that we're interested in understanding better from this period. So the lawsuit has been a very productive avenue of inquiry for us, you could say. We've been able to get information that's never before been seen publicly and give it in the hands of human rights defenders in El Salvador, many of whom have told us that this information is really invaluable in helping victims heal and helping people know the truth of what transpired so many decades ago in El Salvador.
What would appear to be related to your lawsuit against the CIA, about a year after you had filed that, your office got broken into, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Sure. Actually, it was just weeks after the filing of the lawsuit. Okay. I don't really have too much to say about that. It's true. My office, I was a victim of a crime on campus. My office was broken into, and my desktop computer and a hard drive were removed by unknown parties. There's been an investigation, but no resolution to that crime.
But so your office, as far as we know, your office was the only one broken into?
That's right. Yes.
And broken into, hard drive removed. Nothing else was taken?
The hard drive and my desktop computer.
Okay. And but nothing else was taken.
That's right.
And your office was locked again after the perpetrator took off with the hard drive and computer.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And amazingly enough, this appeared to have happened within a day or two of when the CIA director was on campus. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Although, I'm not trying to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that CIA Director John Brennan broke into my office.
Okay. So just a few minutes left. You've just mentioned that you do an incredible amount of Freedom of Information Act requests, and some of those documents you managed to not only get to other organizations, but actually managed to get to some of the victims.
Yes.
Can you in the last few minutes just touch on that?
Yeah, I would say that's been perhaps the most rewarding part of the FOIA component of our research, which has really grown. It's an area where folks in El Salvador have said, this is super helpful. We really want for you to continue doing this. So it's become a big part of what we do. And in fact, some of the documents that we have recovered through the lawsuit have now been introduced into Salvadoran court proceedings as a form of evidence. So that's also very important to us, in the sense that Salvadoran courts are now reckoning with those documents as part of their grappling with these crimes of the past. But I would say even more important than any formal justice proceeding in a court of law has been the immense privilege that it's been for me, and I think for my students that have had a chance to participate in this with me, which is the immense privilege of being able to give to victims who are seeking sometimes the most basic information about the disappearance or death of a loved one, to be able to give them some pieces of information. And it's not the kind of information that I would have hoped at the beginning, right? That, we're going to find the smoking gun in the documents. These are shreds of information, small clues, references perhaps to a missing loved one that are less than a sentence long at times. But nonetheless, again, words come up short in doing justice to the depth of the reaction of so many victims and survivors who have been denied access to the most basic information about disappeared or killed loved ones, who have told me time and again in different settings, different individuals, you have no idea how important it is to me that you and your team of students at this university very far from here were able to obtain this information. You have no idea how important that is to me in my healing process. Of course, that's just one tiny grain of sand, in what is required truly for justice or for people to heal. But it's a tremendous honor to be able to contribute to those positive processes in our small way through our research and work at the University of Washington.
All right, we're just about out of time. We're talking with Angelina Godoy. She is director of the University of Washington's Center for Human Rights. How can people find out more about your work and stay up to date on events like the El Mozote Massacre?
Well, if they're interested in our work in El Salvador, again, the best way to do that would be to follow our El Salvador project, which goes by the name Unfinished Sentences, to follow us on Facebook. We also have a mailing list for the Center for Human Rights. The Center for Human Rights also has a Facebook presence, the center as a whole, right? Because we don't only work in El Salvador, we work in many other places, including in the United States. So it would be a great way to stay in touch with us, both to follow us on Facebook, but also contact our office and get put on our mailing list, so you'll receive our regular communications throughout the year.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.